Adaïma, la nécropole prédynastique. Depuis plusieurs décennies, la découverte d'une nécropole composée de plusieurs centaines de tombes, datant de 3600 à 2900 avant Jésus-Christ, intrigue les spécialistes de l'Égypte antique. Cette nécropole, située en Haute-Égypte, au sud de la ville de Luxor, est liée à une population contemporaine des premières dynasties égyptiennes. Les fouilles de la nécropole d'Adaïma ont été effectuées sur la zone habitat ainsi que sur la zone nécropole. La zone nécropole est divisée entre le cimetière de la zone ouest, plus ancien, qui a été partiellement pillé et ravagé au fil des siècles, et la partie est, qui a subi quelques pillages, mais dont des dizaines de tombes sont restées intactes. Cette partie est du cimetière est la plus récente. Et comme le note l'archéologue Eric Krubesi en page 38 de son article « La nécropole d'Adaïma, une première synthèse », dans la revue Archéonile numéro 8 datant de l'année 1998, citation « Le cimetière de l'Est est plus récent. Il se rapporte à une période où les deux premières dynasties étaient déjà en place. » Grâce à l'étude de cette nécropole, nous avons pu en apprendre sur les rites funéraires des populations et la manière dont elles enterraient leurs morts. Des cas de ce qui ressemblait à des tentatives de momification sont aussi détectés dans le compte-rendu de Adaïma II, la nécropole prédynastique, dont au moins une avec des bordelettes. Une toilette funéraire était pratiquée sur le défunt, que l'on parait ensuite de bracelets en cuivre, avant de le placer dans des jarres, des cercueils en argile ou, pour les notables, des cercueils en bois. Dans la revue Archéonile numéro 8, page 105, l'article de l'égyptologue Stan Hendricks précise que, finalement, les inhumations en jarre de la première et deuxième dynastie, telles qu'elles ont été trouvées à Adaïma, peuvent être considérées comme les prédécesseurs directs des tombes semblables, attestées fréquemment dans des cimetières de l'Ancien Empire. Quelle était l'origine de ces populations prédynastiques? Ce sont les chercheurs de l'IFAO, l'Institut français d'archéologie orientale, qui ont effectué les fouilles dans la nécropole, tout comme dans l'habitat de ces populations. En 2016, un article du site de l'INRAP, l'Institut national de recherche archéologique préventive, un organisme officiel de la République française, qui est sous la tutelle du ministère de la Culture, assure que les populations prédynastiques de la nécropole d'Adaïma étaient des Africains d'origine subsaharienne. Citation. D'après les analyses morphologiques, la population inhumée, l'une des plus anciennes de la vallée, se rapproche de celle d'Afrique subsaharienne, bien différente de toutes celles déjà étudiées, ce qui pose la question de la succession des populations dans la vallée du Nil au cours du temps. L'archéologue et paléanthropologue biologique Eric Krubesi a participé aux campagnes de fouilles d'Adaïma, qui ont eu lieu en plusieurs fois, étendues sur plusieurs années. Dans un article de 2010 intitulé « Le peuplement de la vallée du Nil », il écrit « Il est notamment impossible pour les fouilles anciennes de savoir quelle partie de population répartie sur quel laps de temps ils représentent. Dans ce contexte, l'étude de la population du cimetière est d'Adaïma prendra toute sa valeur. En effet, il s'agit d'un cimetière d'enfants bien conservé. Les couronnes dentaires de la denture définitive sont en place, mais non usées, incluses dans l'os pour la plupart. Et la durée du cimetière, comme sa représentativité par rapport à la population générale, sont de mieux en mieux cernées. L'une des particularités de la population d'Adaïma, mise en évidence lors d'une étude préliminaire, est l'importante fréquence des canines supérieures dites bushmènes, qui présentent une variation anatomique très fréquente dans certaines populations africaines, notamment les Khoisan. L'origine africaine de la population, déjà largement soupçonnée, est là confirmée. Éric Krubézy signale l'importance de ces découvertes réalisées ces dernières années, puisque selon lui, elles font voler en éclats le consensus sur l'origine des anciens Égyptiens. Il note: les populations contemporaines de la vallée ne peuvent plus être considérées aussi facilement qu'on avait pu l'envisager autrefois, comme les descendantes directes des populations dynastiques. En effet, l'époque historique semble avoir conduit à des arrivées de sujets ainsi qu'à des choix matrimoniaux bien distincts entre communautés religieuses. Dans le livre Adaïma 2, la nécropole prédynastique, Éric Krubézy et ses confrères ont fait un travail énorme en répertoriant et détaillant le contenu de dizaines de tombes sur les 300 à 400 premières pages de l'ouvrage. Ce monumental travail a permis de connaître approximativement l'âge, le sexe, la taille, l'usure des dents, voire les maladies qui ont pu frapper les membres de cette communauté. On a remarqué un dimorphisme sexuel assez prononcé chez cette population, c'est-à-dire que les différences de taille entre les hommes et les femmes étaient de l'ordre de 15 cm. Mais une tombe a particulièrement attiré l'attention des scientifiques. C'est la S100. De constitution très solide, l'homme qui était enterré dans cette tombe semblait être d'un niveau social très élevé et culminait à une taille située entre 1,85 m et 1,90 m, ce qui pour l'époque est extraordinairement grand. Qui sont ces hommes de grande taille et d'où venaient-ils? Sur la base des analyses scientifiques pluridisciplinaires amassées par son équipe, Éric Krubézy explique à la page 530 que ces populations sont des populations typiquement africaines, nées en Afrique et issues d'un environnement typiquement nilotique. Citation: Adaïma, une population africaine. Les reconstitutions de la stature ont montré que la population d'Adaïma se rapprochait plus des séries de références africaines qu'européennes. Certaines données retrouvées à Adaïma sont en fait le propre de la plupart des populations nilotiques, quelles que soient les époques, du néolithique à l'époque moderne. L'étude d'Adaïma a permis de remettre en cause beaucoup de croyances en ce qui concerne l'Égypte ancienne. On était par exemple persuadé, écrit Éric Krubézy, que l'écriture hiéroglyphique était apparue soudainement en Égypte sous l'influence de la Mésopotamie. Adaïma vient nous rappeler que si cette écriture est bien apparue à la fin du prédynastique, en réalité, sa conceptualisation s'est étalée sur près de 1000 ans, et que ces populations y ont parfaitement contribué. Une question se pose. Est-ce si étonnant d'apprendre cela? En vérité, non. Nous savons depuis des années que ce sont bien des peuples africains qui sont à l'origine du site archéologique de Nabta Playa, dans lequel on étudiait l'astronomie plusieurs siècles avant l'avènement de la première dynastie égyptienne. Pour illustrer ces preuves, voici quelques extraits qui relatent tous ces travaux sur l'émergence de la civilisation égyptienne par des populations africaines.
And what would happen is that during a 2-3 weeks period, they would drench the Sahara, and in the depressions, of course, they would form temporary lakes. It's beautiful pastoral fields, you know. Now, because of that, the nomads of the area. Now, we don't know where they came from, but there's a very strong case now that they came from the Tibesti Mountains in the Chad. A long, long time ago. They were black people. They looked like Maasais, very, very slender, very beautiful black people. We don't know when they came, maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. Something drove them into what is today the Sahara.
So, my beginning comment here, ancient Egypt was in Africa. We can't really doubt that, can we? It's in the continent. But more important, ancient Egypt was of Africa. And that, of course, is not the way the past 2 centuries of Western scholarship have generally presented its history. It's long past time, I would say, for all of us to discard a whole set of old notions about Egypt, notions rooted in really the self-serving racialist presumptions of 19th century Europeans, notions that only too often people even today simply assume. They've never thought to examine those ideas. They're back in the background, informing our minds even when we're not aware they are. And on the historical and the scholarly level, that re-examination is underway. The most recent, maybe we should say generations, the last 30 years or so, of scholars and scholarship on Nubia and Egypt are bringing together a whole new body, and maybe I should say whole new bodies of evidence, revealing the African rootedness of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian culture.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the prehistoric origins in Black Africa of ancient Egyptian culture. My guest is Professor Thomas Brophy, who is the president of the California Institute of Human Science. He has authored several books on this subject, including The Origin Map, Prehistoric, Megalithic, Astrophysical Maps of the Universe, and 2 books co-authored with Robert Bouval, Black Genesis, The Prehistoric Origins of Ancient Egypt, and Imhotep the African, Architect of the Cosmos. He is also author of a wonderful book called The Mechanism Demands a Mysticism, Explorations of Spirit, Matter, and Physics.
There were a few early voices that rejected the notion of Egypt as a Near Eastern civilization. Writing in 1911, E.A. Wallace Budge drew on African ethnography to inform his understanding of ancient Egyptian religion, seeing similarities with contemporary practices among Nilotic cultures as evidence for an indigenous Northeast African origin, like the Dinka here, particularly cattle symbolism.
But I'm somewhat unorthodox amongst Egyptologists in that I very strongly feel, and maybe it's my perspective from the South, that ancient Egypt is an African civilization fundamentally different from Near Eastern civilizations. And you can really see it if you look at the institution of kingship, the symbols, and especially coming out of a deep past during the Neolithic. So we tend to look at Egypt as it is today, and when we think about the origins of Egyptian civilization. But the ecology was completely different. The Sahara was a vast grassland with pastoral nomads running out. It's the earliest domestication of cattle, and a very sophisticated culture. There was an interaction with, it was part of a larger cattle complex. And when you look at the different practices that come into Egypt, you see that's the fundamental core. And Henry Frankfurt recognized this in the 1940s, talking about an African substratum to Egyptian civilization. And more recent work, as we know more and more about this, suggests that Egypt is coming out of those traditions. And that's where you see the cattle elements in Egyptian civilization too. The king wears a bull's tail, for example. Hathor is a preeminent fertility goddess. The Wa scepter, which is actually a dried bull's penis, that's still used as a symbol in some Nilotic cattle pastoralists.
So here we have a people who were navigating the desert, who finally found themselves at this Napta Playa, only 100 kilometers from the Nile, 7,000 years before the Pharaoh, stayed there. And the reason they stayed there is that suddenly it clicked to them that they didn't have to move. They began to dig deep wells, and they stayed. So in the dry season, they would have water from the wells, and then the rain would come and replenish. So they stayed for thousands of years. And the navigation and astronomy became more religious. They still practiced the astronomy, it became more and more religious. Hence why there's all these strange ceremonial sites. So here we have the roots of a complex culture who knew about to move stones, who had domesticated cattle, who were practicing basic agriculture. We found cereal growth thousands of years before the pharaohs appeared.
By the way, this is just going off here for a second. Some of you may have seen or heard about a recent genetics article that makes the ancient Egyptians out to be Levantines. Let me be very clear, these findings come from one locale in a large stretch of possible locales in northern Egypt, and the finds date well after the foundational periods of ancient Egypt. It's somewhat as if, I was thinking of this particular image, rather than investigating DNA from a 17th century cemetery in Plymouth, we instead choose to investigate DNA from a later 19th century cemetery in South Boston. And then we conclude, having done that the United States was founded by people of Irish descent, and that Americans were predominantly, are predominantly Irish.
Yes, yeah, there are giraffes and animals like that depicted in the rock art. And we went there to visit a beautifully painted prehistoric cave that was discovered in that region, just discovered in 2007. We went there, we were the second group to go there in 2008. We went with the discoverer of the cave. It has on the ceiling very beautiful prehistoric rock art depicting the people who lived there and their raising of cattle and various domestic scenes and that sort of thing.
We're talking about black Africans.
Yes. Yes.
In this area. As I understand it, Egyptian archaeologists and Egyptologists have largely suggested that the ancient Egyptian culture developed independently of black Africa. That's sort of the conventional viewpoint.
Yes, that's sort of the conventional view that had been followed. And recently, though, it is changing because, as you mentioned, related to the find of the art, the rock art in that region, there was also found, actually by the same people, a hieroglyph with a cartouche, the name of a Middle Kingdom king, Egyptian pharaoh. And that really changed ideas in this regard because the area is now and has been since 3000 BC so extreme desert. It was assumed there was no travel to that area from even dynastic times of ancient Egypt.
First of all, we know also from the ancient inscription that the Egyptian, we have different races that were part of this Egyptian culture and nation. So we have one that is from the Delta, Lower Egypt. They were more short and curly, more like the Yemenite, if you want. And we have another race of the ancient Egyptian coming from the upper side of Egypt, lower from the Delta. We call it the Upper Egypt. They are more like Dexter. They are more like Sudan, tall. I would say black, you know, that...
Now, the climate changes again. The desert becomes more and more arid, and the Nile becomes more and more habitable. The floods become gentle, and these people literally were forced to move. They had to move out of the Sahara. And the obvious place they went is the Nile.
Well, that isn't necessarily how the writers of the article meant it to be interpreted, but that's certainly the way I've had people interpreting it to me. Even someone with a Coptic, seemed to be a Coptic last name from the sounds of things, berating me for being such a terrible human being all these years of my whole career for ever having thought of Egypt as being African. So anyway.
And this was understood by, at least by the ancient Greeks, probably by the ancient Persians, but maybe the ancient Sumerians who were students of astrology. Your findings suggest, if I understand it, that the precession of the equinoxes was understood by these prehistoric people in Black Africa who created these particular megaliths, like an astronomical calendar, sometimes called the Stonehenge of the Sahara.
Yes, the Nabta Playa find was announced by CNN as the Stonehenge of the Sahara. And it's a fascinating site. It does have megaliths. And however, the calendar circle that got a lot of attention is composed of smaller stones that come up to about your knee. But that forms a very interesting calendar circle, which has astronomical meaning. And that calendar circle is in a complex of megalithic large stone structures and alignments as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, do we know anything at all about the people who created these structures?
Yes, we know they were Black African people. Their remains are studied anthropologically, and they were the people inhabiting the region of the time.
Mm-hmm. I understand that they also seem to have some sort of religious cult involving the ceremonial rituals that had to do with the cow. The cow was very important to them.
Yes, the cattle cult and the Sirius and cattle iconography was very important to them, as well as in ancient Egypt, which came later, in ancient Egyptian civilization. And at Nabta Playa, there were not found any graves of humans. No human kings or leaders' graves were found, but a very finely constructed grave of a cow was found.
Which is something similar to what you will find in ancient Egypt.
Yes.
Where, like the Serapeum, where there's a whole large, enormous complex with embalmed bulls.
Yes. Yeah. So there are many elements, clearly, of the culture that was operating at Nabta Playa in the earlier time that moved to the Nile Valley and became the ancient Egyptian dynastic civilization.
But I think you have to see Egypt as an African civilization. And some of my colleagues tell me, well, why does it, it doesn't really matter anyway. And I, no. Yeah, absolutely. It defeats racism. Ultimately, it defeats racism because you can't have a civilization like Egypt or Nubia as well. I mean, Reisner went to great lengths to try and make Nubian civilization not African. And people called him out on it. Even that early Juncker, for example, criticized his characterization of Kerma as a kind of colony. But I mean, it defeats racism. You can't say an inferior people built the pyramids and created Egyptian civilization. So I think it's important to make that statement.
Anyway, so another arresting body of archaeological evidence exists relating to the ancient sharing of ritual and belief across this culture area. In the 5th millennium BCE, Nabta, you can find that if you look on the map, it's between kind of off to the west, south of the first cataract. 200 kilometers, 250 kilometers southwest of Aswan. This was a major ritual center with astronomically oriented megalithic arrays.
There is a huge consensus here. I mean, there is most anthropologists now and most senior Egyptologists are accepting that there was a mistake. That the origins of the pharaoh, there was two theories, that either they came from the Asiatic and Levant side, the Mediterranean, or that they sprouted themselves. I mean, it just happened. Well, now the evidence is pointing entirely in a different direction. It's pointing to the west, to the sub-Saharan region, and even further. We think that the people that we're talking about came from probably the Chad and these areas. Now, the reason is that these areas were very, very inviting for human beings. The Tibesti Mountains are superb places for human beings to flourish, whereas the other places were very agitated. So the whole picture is changing. There is a bias, of course. There is a bias because there is established theories, there is established books, and the big bias is going to come from probably those who have a difficulty in stomaching the idea that civilization, the roots of civilization, is from a black people from the sub-Saharan. You know, and we've suspected this for a long time. But there is a problem, there's an ethic problem here. The Egyptians, the historians have a problem. We attribute all our knowledge to the Greeks. We attribute our knowledge to some sort of Greek super invention. You know, whereas we know the Egyptians had architecture, astronomy, mathematics before them, and now we know that the sub-Saharan people had this before them.
This bias was illustrated in a modern scientific context by a recent DNA study in Nature Communications that received a great deal of press, unfortunately. They concluded that the foundational population of ancient Egypt was related not to other Africans, but rather to Middle Eastern peoples, contradicting modern genetic studies of contemporary Egyptians. They go on to posit that modern genetic ties between Egyptians and other Africans came with the medieval Arab slave trade. Nature's own publicity for this piece reflects how deeply embedded this assumption is, even in the academy, and here it is here. And you know, we have someone saying how nice it is that this study now provided empirical evidence for this assumption at the genetic level, without even realizing that this completely begs the question. The study was fundamentally flawed. The authors overgeneralized all of Egyptian history from a sample of only 90 individuals from a single poorly documented cemetery in northern Egypt, only 3 with a full genome. The burials date to the latest periods of Egyptian history, so how you extrapolate then back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization is puzzling at best. And all but three or four individuals came from after 1000 BCE. They did not include any individuals from southern Egypt or Nubia, something they admit as a weakness only at the very end of the article.
So today in Egypt, the archaeologists often refer to, and I've been there, to connections between ancient Egyptian culture and the Sumerian culture and the Crete culture and the Persian culture. Yet when you visit Egypt, especially around the Aswan and the southern part of the Nile, you see mostly black people.
Yes. Yeah. And we know from the anthropological evidence that the people just predating the dynastic civilization in the Nabta Playa region were black African people.
In 1948, he argued that in order to understand Egyptian kingship and religion, one should use the ethnography of the, and I quote, groups of people who are the true survivors of that great East African substratum out of which Egyptian culture arose, end quote. In contrast to most Egyptologists, even today, he saw any Near Eastern influence on Egypt's origins as ultimately superficial and adaptive, and I quote, "We observe that Egypt, in a period of intensified creativity, became acquainted with the achievements of Mesopotamia, that it was stimulated, and that it adapted to its own rapid development such elements as seemed compatible with its efforts. It mostly transformed what it had borrowed, and after a time rejected even these modified derivations."
And so many Egyptians today who probably think of themselves primarily as Mediterranean people, even though they're on the African continent, look down at the idea that their very powerful ancient culture might have emerged out of Black Africa.
Yeah, and it's clearly, obviously, a modern ethnic view or ethnic mindset that leads to that kind of thinking. Not any evidence from ancient history, I don't think.
So